on his forthcoming book. Right, the speaker today needs no introduction. Right? His first book, This Culture of Ours, defines the way we study the Tang transition through the ideas of great thinkers. His second book on Daoxue Neo-Confucianism demonstrates, right, how we could actually study Neo-Confucianism as a political and social movement while not losing sight of its philosophical claims. His forthcoming book, right, which I've had the privilege of reading an earlier draft, is a combination of his works of more than 20 years that aims at showing the value of thinking about intellectual changes on a micro and local level. Professor Bo also promised us that he will write an intellectual biography of Zhu Xi before he retires, right? But that should take a while, right? So for now, we can look forward to the publication of this book, titled Localizing Learning, the Literati Enterprise in Wuzhou, 1100 to 1600, right? So I believe, right, it will be available next month. So while we eagerly await the arrival of this book, let's hear from the author himself first. Right? Professor Bo will speak for about 15 minutes to an hour, and we'll set some time aside for questions after his presentations. So is that good?
Good.
Okay, so over to you, Peter.
Okay. So you can see my screen now, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Let me begin by saying that this work that has to do with a place nowadays called Jinhua Prefecture, in Song and Yuan times, Wuzhou, in the middle of Zhejiang province, is in many ways made possible by many of the people who are on this call. That is, graduate students and students at Harvard over the years, both in terms of field work that was done for 2 summers in the early 2000s, and then the treating of the reworking of all the data to make it available. We were going through various villages. You can recognize some of the people there collecting materials, interviewing people, doing photography, doing architectural records. You see some of them now. If you look carefully, you can see Professor Ong here and on the upper left and on the right, and all sorts of people who have really, without whose work this would not have been possible. And I'd like to just take a moment to recognize the person with glasses in the upper middle, Gung Zhenfeng, who traveled with us, a very loquacious person who knew an inordinate amount about the facts of local history, and who most regrettably passed away well before his proper time. So the place that I'm talking about is here, there in the middle. The documentation we've collected is open to the public. We've been working on it and then gone through various software changes and online. Everything that's here was actually prepared by graduate students over the years. And a particularly good example is Lujai in Dongyang, which has this extraordinary compound beginning in the late Yuan dynasty, early Ming, and which has now been created in translation, interactive translation. And if you just go to the website, China Local, Omeka, FAS Harvard, you can get to it. One of our colleagues, Chen Sung, has taken on himself to take some of the materials and organize them and make them online at his site through Bucknell, which you can also read through the Harvard site. Okay, so in any case, I wrote a book. Some of what we collected is really relevant to the book, but really our collection work was much more about giving people a tactile sense, a direct and immediate sense of local history. We eventually, I taught various seminars on this, and so The book itself is actually a product of discussions with students, all of whom now have published books and articles of their own, which I've taken advantage of and which are cited in here. So the book is called Localizing Learning. It's about Literati in Wuzhou, and it has several chapters. It begins in Southern Song with Lu Chen, turns to issues of examination learning, in chapter 2, category books, Leishu in Chinese, and issues of broad learning, erudition, the role of Daoxue in the late, in the 13th century into the early 14th century in Wujo, problems of what to do once you've been conquered, the discussion in the chapter called Collegiality and Kinship, which is in fact about the creation of a definition of local identity, then what happens in Ming with various kinds of revivals, and then has an end, which is also sort of the end of an era and the beginning of a new era. And to try to summarize the book, what I'm going to try to do is talk a little bit about what I've learned from it. But I want to begin with a series of justifications. And the first is, why do intellectual history, or what, when I talk about intellectual history, what do I mean? Now, I came to intellectual history out of an interest in political and institutional history. Many of the people who do intellectual history came to it out of an interest in the history of thought. But I ended up with an interest in the history of thought because I was interested in politics institutions. And what I was interested in was the problem of, how do people with power make the choices they make? How do we account for their choices? And it seemed to me that we needed to think about their choices in terms of, let's put it like this, in terms of the templates through which they saw the world. In other words, what were the ideas they had in mind that were shared within their culture at that particular moment, within their circles, their networks, for seeing the world and identifying the problems in it and identifying the possible choices they had to respond to it. So my version of intellectual history is in some ways about the ideas people have for interacting in their interaction with the world around them, which leads me to think, open myself up perhaps more to social history than a pure history of thought or history of philosophy would have done. The second is the period, because I'm going from the 12th century in Wujo to the end of the 15th, around 1100 to 1600. And the period is one in which we see the ancient style of writing, Guwen, still playing a central role in examination learning, but at the same time, the beginning of Neo-Confucianism, of Daoxue, of the learning of the way, and the fellowship of the way, as Hui Tillman has called it, emerging as a powerful force in literati society. And the period ends, of course, with the beginning of the signs of evidential learning. What this suggests to me is that the subject for an intellectual history of this period is, if we want to include Guwen, ancient style writing, and evidential learning, as well as Daoxue, that the subject of intellectual history is not only people, but is their way of understanding learning, of xue, right? And that learning can be Kaozheng xue, it could be Daoxue, it could be Wenxue. But the whole point, I think, is that if we take xue as the subject, it's very hard for me to see why we should limit our inquiry to philosophical thought and moral thought, since it's obvious that the people we're looking at, if we're looking at political institutional history and literati, thus elites, that these are people who themselves think of learning in a broader way than our contemporary disciplines. The third issue, I think, is why a local study? After all, if we're looking at ideas and thought, things like ancient style writing, Daoxue, evidential learning, all of these are national, if not national, at least beginning at first regional phenomena that become national. So why do a local study? And there are two kinds of answers to that, I think. One is that, well, every place can have a history, right? So we can write a history of a place and talk about a place. But it's also the case that a place can tell us about history. That is, we can look at what goes on in a particular place and see the ways in which things happened that are larger, more national or more regional phenomena. Right? That looking at the ground level, right, allows us to see kinds of interaction that would not be obvious if we just think only in national terms. Now, somebody once said to me, well, not only was somebody, many people have said to me, but do you think Jinhua or Wuzhou is representative? And my answer to that is always, it's representative of places that are just like it. In other words, I don't think there is one place in China that's representative. I think there are many places, but they're not an infinite number of variations. And I think of work done by Chan Sung on Sichuan, of Li Qi on Ningbo, by Wang Changwei, Ong Changwei on Guangzhou, and we see, I think, lots of possible variations, but not an infinite number. And so there remains the need, I think, to do comparison, because even within the Southeast, I think a Jiangxi phenomena, Northern Zhejiang phenomena, Fujian phenomena are not necessarily the same. So that gets me to the final question of justification. Why this place? Why Wuzhou Jinhua? And part of the answer is that in the 11th century, Wujo is nothing much. And in the 12th century and 13th century, it becomes something, right? So it's a place that gains importance. And not every place gained importance. If we look to its west, to Quzhou, or to its south, to Chuzhou, I don't think either one of these places, which certainly become more important in southern Song, but either one really matches Wuzhou in importance. And yet there are places in Fujian, right, that are probably more important than Wuzhou. So Wuzhou is interesting, becomes something, but it's not as if everything becomes something. The other reason for this place is that there's a path of scholarship. It's a great good fortune that we could look at the work of Sun Kequan, who early on at Donghai Daxue in Taiwan started to work on published on Wuzhou. Jack Langlois, the late Jack Langlois, did as well in a dissertation. The late John D'Ardès has a number of articles here. Ye Wenxin, whose name I'm embarrassed to say, Ye Wenxin of Berkeley, is a book on the people from Wuzhou. Hoyt Tillman wrote an early article there, and many more since. Hilda de Wert, Beverly Bosler, Chen Wenyi, Suki Li, Li Zhonghuan, and more. So the place is here. It's looking at the 7 Xian, or 8 Xian by the end of the 15th century. Now in the middle of Zhejiang province, as you see from the inset map in the upper right. The black line represents the coastal or the postal routes. One coming down to Lanxi and then going one east and one west. And the rail line in orange represents another route that actually existed in the past, but was not formally recognized as a postal route. Now, one side I make clear that this is in some ways looking at people and elites. It means we are talking about literati. And it's good to make a distinction, I think, between the notion of literati, which I'm using to translate the Chinese word shi, from just the notion of local elite. I think one of the good things about Robert Himes in his article in the Cambridge History of China on social history was that he came around, I think, to seeing that really in talking about Sung history, we're really talking about the Shi as a national elite. But their relationship to the state, or let us put it like this, the institutional ties they have change from Southern Sung into Yuan and into Ming. And there have been various discussions of that, but the most obvious is through the examination system, terribly important to them in Southern Sung, not so important in Yuan, although certainly education was still important. And then in Ming, a far more elaborated institutional system that really ties local elites much more into the state. And it's interesting if you read mid-Ming statecraft writers who are concerned with local society, such as Hai Rui or Lu Kun, you'll see that they treat all the school students basically as part of the governing apparatus. They don't see them as people who are betwixt and between government and the common people. They see them sort of on their side as part of governing. But the Shi, as local elites, are also a national elite. And the way I would put it is the Shi are a national elite who, by and large, for 99% of the people, have a local existence. The final thing to keep in mind is this whole notion of the Southern Sung state and it being in retreat. One of the things I think that has bothered scholars in China considerably about some of the ways social historians in the US have talked about Southern Sung is they've talked about it in terms of the retreat of the state. And in part, I think for anyone who lives in the People's Republic of China, the notion, and perhaps also in Taiwan, although less so, I think, the notion of a retreat of a state is incomprehensible. After all universities are part of the state apparatus. I think that the solution to that is not to talk about retreat of the state or not, but to talk about a different state. That the Southern Sung state is not, in the first place, a new policy state. It's not trying to continue the new policies of Wang Anshi, as happened under Zhezong and happened under Huizong in Northern Sung. And that's the first point. And the second point is that it's a southern state. Right? It is no longer trying to run to the North China Plain, and its defensive perimeter is very different from that of the Northern Sung. And so one last point with maps, in this case it's a Southern Sung map showing civil and military degrees during the Southern Sung. So the northern people too, because they're under the Jin, so it's all sort of together. But the point of the map is to say, and this is actually has relevance for intellectual history. If you're going to do intellectual history, you might as well look and figure out where the intellectuals are. And there's going to be pretty much a correspondence between the places that produce a lot of examination candidates and degree holders and intellectual liveliness. And I think that's true here as well, that X marks the spot, in this case for Wuzhou, but it's one of the places where you have in Southern Sung, a lot of examination candidates, but it's not the only place. So you have the Fujian coast, Southern Jiangsu, or what was then Liangzhi Xilu, and then Zhedong or Liangzhi Donglu, where Wujo is, but also Taizhou, Mingzhou, Ningbo, and so on. Another way of looking at this is through population modeling, which is to see that in Wujo, we have, because it's a combination of mountains and plains or floodplains, we have concentrations of population. And I think concentrations of population are important. That's the dark red, of course, because information flows more quickly when you have people concentrated together. Right? greater turnover, there's more velocity. And so it's more active. And so in the Southern Sung, more than, for example, in some later times, Wuzhou was a fairly active intellectual place, or became one. I'm going to skip over these. This is on the left, population, on the right, Ming population and civil service degrees in Ming provinces. On the left, looking at same phenomenon, macro regions. On the right, looking at in relation to national highways. And the national highway part is interesting because the major national highways or courier routes go around Jiangxi, not through it, but Jiangxi is still a very important area for literati culture. Now, I want to begin with talking about, I'm not going to try to summarize the book because I want you all to go out and get it. And certainly for those of you who are involved in the whole project, I'll be sending you copies. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I sort of concluded or thought about in the course of writing it. And there's a lot to say about Lu Zuchen. Hoyt has written about it. Others have written about it. Some people want all of Zhedong learning to be derived from Lu Zuchen. What I'm impressed by Lu Zuchen is that he was a bit of the kind of person, as an influential local teacher, who was a bit of everything to everybody, right? And this is that passage that you see here, and I'll just read through the English. With outstanding and exceptional literati, Lu Zuchen would discuss understanding legitimate succession and correcting the standards. With deeply moral and faithful literati, he would discuss correcting the mind and making the intention sincere. With a literati who liked the ancient and admired the distant, he would discuss institutions and social norms. With those who loved the literary and the decorative, he would discuss language and written characters. Right down to those who had withdrawn from public affairs or who were seeking political advancement, he guided everyone according to his character and pushed them to improve so as to realize their ambitions. And that does strike me as being Lu Zuchen. The other thing about Lu Zuchen is that I don't think Lu Zuchen is very interested in local society, not because he's interested in local identity, but because he's interested in teaching local people how to be national, how to be part of a national picture, how to rise above their circumstances and share his view of what literati values should be. But as we see here in this passage, done by, in fact, one of his leading students, what we see here is that he recognized there were a diversity of interests among literati about what they cared about, what they wanted to be, what they wanted to learn, and he accommodated them all. The 12th and 13th century, it seems to be, had intellectual trends that were some of which we all knew about, and some of which I didn't know about until I started to work in this period. Obviously, examination learning is important. And it turns out, and I came across this because there was an exhibit at the National Palace Museum, the Gugong in Taiwan, of Sung and Yuan editions. And as I was looking through the editions, I noticed there were a number of editions from Wujo. And that led me to then really pursue the matter of who are the publishers in Wujo. And we know we have extant editions from 7 different publishers. There were probably more. Publishing became a big thing. Well, publishing became a big thing because there were an enormous number of examination students in part, but also because people were learning to write. And when you learn to write and you write a lot, you start to publish. And that got into the whole issue of publishing for examination learning, which again, I think examination learning is much broader than just what was tested in the examinations. But in particular, the role of Yilun Wenzhang, argumentative essays. And argumentative essays, particularly those associated with Su Shi in a circle, but going beyond that, including Wang Anshi, for example, Zhang Gong, a variety of other people, but Su Shi and his circle being a dominant group. The whole point of an Yilun essay, of Yilun writing, is to have an opinion of your own. Right? If you don't have opinion of your own, what's to write about? And that, it strikes me as it being the great contrast with Dao Xue. Right? That Dao Xue says there are ideas about self-cultivation, of self-discovery, of self-development that should lead you in the same moral direction. After all, the whole point of learning is to become a sage. You may want to be a sure literatist, but ultimately you want to be a sage. And that is a moral course, a moral path. Argumentative essays, Yilun Wenzhang is saying, no, you need to have an opinion of your own, you need to be able to express it. And if you don't have an opinion that stands out, you're not worth paying attention to. So in that sense, examination learning is training people to have ideas of their own. And that perhaps explains why in the 12th century, there is an extraordinary amount of writing and publishing that takes place by local men. And it's not just that they are writing, they're publishing books. And we have this wonderful collection done in the early 20th century, 1920s, on the Jinhua Jingji Zhi. It's one of a series of books that exists that do the bibliography of a local place. And when you start to look at what people are, the books they're writing in the 12th century, they really develop, they go along two lines. There are Dao Xue writers, and then there's everyone else. The historical writers, the literary writers, the scholarly writers, and so on. But writing books has become a thing. And that's true for Dao Xue people as well. It's just that they're writing different kinds of things. The other thing that I got very interested in was category books, these leishu. And this goes back to this, the famous passage from the Lunyu, where the master says, "Junzi bo shui yu and yue zhui li, ke yi fu pan yi fu." If the noble person learns broadly in one and ties it together with ritual, then he can avoid going astray or going too far astray. And what you really have to see between those two phrases, "Junzi bo shui yu wen, yue zhui li," it is the word "but," right? It's people do bo shui, people do broad learning, but it gets them into trouble unless they tie it together in some way. In this case, and certainly for Zhu Xi and the Cheng brothers, bo shui yu and yue zhui li means that you learn in order to find things to practice, right? Which is not how the people I'm going to be talking about in a second thought of it. But they want to get to a non-antagonistic relationship between bo shui and yue zhui, right? I think actually in the Analects, it's a problematic relationship, that people who do bo shui will get lost unless they tie themselves down, restrain themselves, restrict themselves. Well, the interesting thing in the mid-13th century is that Wujo, and this is really between, I'd say, around 1200 and 1240. Wujo writers put together three enormous category books. The Jizuan Yuanhai, Panzimu and others, which is a literary thesaurus, the Yudiji Sheng, Wang Shangzhi, which is a cultural geography, and Zhang Ruyu's Chunsuo Kaosuo. Chunsuo Kaosuo has been known really until now through its Yuan version. And the Yuan version is very much in Dao Xue inflected. The Sung version, which is only 100 chapters, 10 times 10 chapters in this original Sung version, versus the much bigger, commonly printed Dao Xue version of the Yuan and Ming. has almost no Dao Xue in it that I can see. Right? All of these three works are, in fact, works of Wenxue, of literary learning. But what makes them more than the common Leishu, which takes the big categories of heaven, earth, and man and organizes snippets of text. What makes these works different is that each one of them has an organizing principle, a distinct organizing principle, which allow them to take all their quotes and put them together. So for the Jizhi and Yuanhai, for example, it's the relationship between idea and language. And the author, well, in fact, there were three authors, three compilers, make the argument that there is a finite number of ideas in the world, but a more or less infinite number of possible ways of expressing them. And they're going to figure that all out. And they make the claim, we have all the ideas here that you can want to say, but there are lots of ways of talking about them. And they have no commitment, as far as I can tell, to right ideas or wrong. The UDG Sung, which presents looks like a cultural geography, very much in the tradition of the Taipei Huayuji, in contrast to things like the Yuanfeng Zhou Yuzhi, the state geographies, administrative geographies, is in fact meant to aid people in writing, and organizes its texts that describe places, including some comments by the author, by Wang Zhongzhi himself, makes comments in ways that are, or sets it up in ways that are meant to help you write well. And that, of course, makes the point that writing about locality has become an interesting thing for people to do. And the Chunshu Kaosuo is about statecraft, beginning with the classics, but the classics as part of statecraft, and is much more sympathetic to Wang Anshi and the new policies than one might expect. In any case, all of them seems to be trying to thread together their Boxue, their broad learning, around particular sets of organizing ideas to hold it all together. Now, all of them have to learn very broadly, keep learning and keep loading up stuff. And one of the things that I think made Daoxue attractive, and where it was that it said, no, we have a method to learn. We have a definite path to follow for learning. We have a way of going about it, and you have to practice it, and then you'll get things right. It's a theory of learning as a moral enterprise. But one of the things that I think is interesting to see here is that for Zhu Xi, the way in which he thinks through issues of learning is with reference to people largely with reference to people in the Northern Song. But once we get to these Daoxue people, beginning with Heji and Wang Bo, right? For them, and Heji, I think, is really only turning to Daoxue in the 1230s or so. That the issue is that what they're learning is the learning of Master Zhu Zixue. And that is, for them, comes to represent Daoxue, by and large. But that leaves them with a choice. Is the point of learning then simply to master the learning of Master Zhu? And I think Heji's answer to that is yes, that's the whole point. And to some extent, Xu Chen shares that view. Or is it to continue the learning that Master Zhu was part of, that represents the restoration of learning by the Cheng brothers and the Zhu Xi tradition, but to continue Zhu Xi. And Wang Bo and Jin Yushang, I think, who have very Boxue tendencies, are part of that continuing the learning progress. Now, the phrase that comes up again and again among these people is Li Tong's advice to Zhu Xi, Li bu huan qi bu yi, 说难者分数 Don't worry about coherence, about Li not being unitary. The hard part is the diversity of manifestations. And I think it's generally true that these guys spend their time focused on the diversity of manifestations, but they focus on it very much within the confines of Master Zhu learning. So the legacy of Boxue is still, the local legacy of Boxue is still there, but now it's been encapsulated or bounded, constrained by Master Zhu learning. So we might say that it's Boxue Yuwen, or Yuezhi Yi Zhu Zixue, constraining it with the learning of Master Zhu. What happens? Now, you notice that two of these four people, the four masters of Jinhua, as they're called, Jin Liushang and Xu Qian, that they lived through the Yuan conquest. And one of the things I tried to think about was what happens to literati and to people like this when they've been conquered by the Mongol regime, and with all the things that the Mongols are doing to make sure that they privilege themselves and make the world serve their interests. And one of the questions to ask is, does the world really need literati? And so the people who write are the people we know about, of course, and they're the ones who are trying to make the case that, yes, the world does need literati. And why does the world need literati? Because we are responsible for ethical behavior. We're responsible, or we ought to be responsible, for the proper conduct of government. And we're responsible for literary learning as well. And of course, Dexing gets folded in with Daoxue fairly well. But those three area topics, right, of Dexing, ethical conduct, moral conduct, government, and literary learning become concerns, shared concerns of Wuzhou literati. And of course, it makes sense to see them as engaging in these things, particularly in Wenxue, because Wenzhang is still, writing is still an evidence of talent. And there are schools, and schools teach Wenxue, right? And even though, sorry, let me go back. And of course, they live in a world of recommendations. Even when the examinations are restored in 1315, recommendations are still the best way into government, the best way to get an appointment as a teacher, or to be allowed to take an exam for being a clerk, or some things like this. So recommendation, how do you get recommendations? You go to other people and show your talent. And Chen Wenyi has written very importantly about this whole process of seeking support from others, and with her notion of prefacing, of the Sung Shu, that's so common. What's interesting, I find, is that the big Wenxue people in Wuzhou, in the Yuan dynasty, Huang Jin, Song Lian, Hu Zhu, Liu Guan, Wang Wei, that these people recognize the Daoxue claim to being the authoritative interpreters of Kungmeng Zhixue, the learning of Confucius and Mencius, as the true line of Ruxue, of Confucianism. They recognize the claim, they will articulate it, but they do not talk about the four books. They do not talk about internality. They do not talk about internal cultivation. And so you can look through their writings, and you would not know, unless they're writing a biography or Muzhiming of somebody who wrote about the four books, you would not know that the four books existed. So they've accommodated the Daoxue claim without actually, it seems to me, fully engaging in Daoxue. And this is the mark, I think, of this whole period, is this, the coexistence of two mindsets that are potentially in conflict, mindsets, worldviews. One is the Daoxue view of a moral world, and the Wenxue view of a cultural world. But I think in Wuzhou, they try to accommodate each other. And the accommodation comes up with the moment at which you start to get the idea of local identity. Up until this point, and I think this is true for the four masters, the Daoshui masters, they're not interested in making an argument for local identity. They are teaching people something that's true for everybody. They're teaching people how to rise above their situation. But Wu Shidao, who is a student at first of these people, but goes on to pass the examinations, he is interested in the idea of local identity. And particularly, he's interested in the idea that Wujo has a history of ethical conduct, literary learning, government principled government service or service with a political integrity, that local men can all share. And if you want to do one thing more than another, that's fine. It's still our shared heritage. And that is this move towards accommodation, which keeps us together, an in-group together, supporting each other. Dao's Jing Shanglu is not entirely unprecedented, but when it is done, it has a major impact locally. And we see from this point on, when he does it in the 1320s, I believe, that it continues on for the next, well, right into the present. Every generation, new books coming out, talking about our heritage of biography, of writings, some more literary, some more Daoshui, but a continuous process of re-emphasizing the notion of a shared heritage. Other thing that happens, I think, is a tremendous growth and interest in genealogies. Right? You know, and if we look in, obviously there are genealogies in Southern Song and Northern Song, but in the Yuan, for the first time, families go out and seek prefaces to genealogies from major public figures. They start to advertise their families, their genealogies, and they make their genealogies into public documents. And that leads in turn to a notion of social responsibility. Now, Fang Xiaoru, all of you know of as the person who Yongle executes with all his 800 kin and associates for refusing to go along with usurpation. Fang Xiaoru, the student, best student of Songlian from Wuzhou, talks about what it means to do a genealogy and why it matters. And it's striking, from my point of view, it's striking because he makes the argument, 3 points along this argument. The first, that ultimately the customs of the district come from each and every descent group, and the state's customs come from the district, and all the customs of the Tiansha society come from every state, and that it's a bottom-up way in which a moral order is set forth. The second point is that literati can transform society without office through their lineages. So how is it we can transform a world through our lineages? Well, we have to go first. We literati families have to go first. And if we do, others will follow, which turns out to happen for better or for worse. There's argument to be made that this is the growth of powerful lineages that we start to see now, the advent of single surname villages that happens now. We can see in the work, the very, very careful work on lineages from this period that Zhongchung Fudan has done, that we see that there are ways in which the lineage comes to dominate local society. Now, I want to make a digression. I want to do a quantitative digression and make a couple points, which I think have some validity, but I'll pass over them fairly quickly. There's a long appendix in the book that talks about this. But basically what we did, or what I did, was take the information about Wuzhou people in the China biographical database, which included the entire set of of Muzhiming, known Muzhiming, and all the kinship relations in those Muzhiming from the Song and Yuan and early Ming, building on some work that Beverly Bosler had done, and start to ask queries. And the China biographical database, as some of you may know, allows for very sophisticated queries about kinship, about all sorts of different kinds of social associations, scholarly, friendship, literary, and so on. And to use this in the biographical database to start to look at the geospatial analysis and network analysis of kinship in Wuzhou, in Song and Yuan, and scholarly networks. This is simply the total of figures in the database that were available. You'll see that the number of so-called index years, that allows us to posit when they were, let's say, their 60th year or what their birth year was. Number almost none for 229 for Northern Song, but over 1,000 for Southern Song, continued on to Yuan, into Ming, and so on. And then I've divided it up by counties as well. Now, there's a point to be made here that I think that thinking about two modes of analysis, one being network analysis and one being spatial analysis, they tell us different things. So Song Lian's network, and this is Song Lian alone here right at the center. But what you see is that, in fact, within his network, there are also subnetworks. There's what CBDB does is in a query is it allows you to say, tell me everyone that's connected to Song Lian, in this case, scholarly connections, literary and scholarly connections, and now tell me also if any of those people are connected to each other. And so that you can see subnetworks within the larger network. Well, that tells us a lot. It tells us a lot about centrality. It tells us about who's important, right? What it doesn't tell us is about where those people are. And so if we look at Song Lian's associations, those same people, now put on a map, we'll see that they're predominantly from Zhedong, from Eastern Zhe, right? Particularly centered around Wujo, around Jinhua, but also some in Jiangxi, a little bit in Fujian. And he has some in other places as well, but it's much more regional than one might think. What I did was look at kinship relations, and this sign 2211 just simply means that I took all the people with index years and said, okay, I'm going to look at Southern Song, and then I'm going to look at Yuan, and I'm going to look 2 generations before, 2 generations after. So, you know, your father's father, your son's son, or your daughter's children too. And I'm going to look 1 marriage distance and 1 collateral distance. So if I'm looking at my grandfather, I'm also looking at my grandfather's brother, okay? Now, if you do that, and we look at Southern Song kinship, and we say, so where are the kinship relations? What we find is that it's fairly well, not fairly well spread across the country, but it's certainly not highly localized. A lot here in Wujo, but not necessarily by any means, just barely the majority. When we look at the network of people, it looks fairly dispersed, but in fact, when we look at the giant component, when we look at all those who are connected together, there's an enormous number of people who are related by kinship, even though we see that dispersion in this map. When we look down here in the Wuzhou area, we find that there is a lot of intermarriage among literati elites. And just taking within the square part of that quadrant, you know, you're looking at something like this, right? And in this case, the different colors represent people from different Shen within Wujo. So what we're also seeing is that there is marriage ties across Shen. Now, in some ways, this fits with the notion that in Southern Song, there's a greater localization of kinship, right? And as you would expect, if there's greater localization of kinship, you would expect on the principle that people try to marry others of the same status, that they would marry together a great deal more. Right? Well, now let's look at Yuan. It's almost entirely, such marriages we know about, are almost entirely local. Almost entirely, 90-some% are local marriages. And so we would say now, what we should find is that kinship ought to be even more integrated. And that is what we do not find. What we find is that kinship is dispersed, atomized, fragmented, not intermarrying very much. And in fact, the giant component is merely this. So we have an interesting problem. Right? We have a high degree of localization of kinship, but we don't have a strong prefectural-wide marriage network. Rather, we have lots and lots of local networks. Lots of local networks, with one exception. And this, by the way, this one big one here happens to be the Zheng family of Pujiang, very famous family. So this raises a question, right? How do literati stay together? If in Southern Song, kinship played a very important role, in Yuan it's not clear at all that they do. In fact, I think, and the answer to that, the reason why is because there's a movement towards lineage building. And if you're building lineages where the daughters all marry out and the wives are all brought in, you probably are going to set up alliances with local villages. That's more important to your lineage interest, perhaps, in terms of land and keeping the peace and water rights than it is having prefectural-wide marriage networks. But they are literati. They do need recommendations. What is going on for them to, how do they go about keeping connections to each other? And here we have an interesting change. Because if we look at scholarly and literary associations in Southern Sung, we get something like this. Right? These are the such as we have it from the record. And the bigger the name, the more central the person is, the thicker the line, the more connections and so on. And this is too many people to make a lot of sense of, but if we just break it down to people who have connections with at least 7 other unique individuals, we get something like this. And then what we notice is that most of these people are not from Wuzhou at all. Lu Zuchen is Luzhou, Chen Liang is. Lu Zuchen is Lu Zujian is Lu Zuchen's brother. But almost everyone else is from somewhere else. In other words, the people who are central to the literati network in Southern Sung, with the exception of Lu Zuchen, are more likely to be from outside of Wuzhou than inside, which suggests that that network of the scholarly networks are not local, particularly local at this point, which fits, of course, with the fact that they're not interested in being local in terms of scholarship. They're interested in being national. And here is sort of a quantitative, numerical aspect. This is looking at different kinds of centrality. And those who are from Wujo are in gray, right? And those who are not from Wujo are in light color. So you see that if you're just looking at the top 20 people in terms of these networks, most of them are from outside. Some of the leading people, if you knock out Lu Zuchen and Chen Liang and Wang Bo, right, then almost everyone else is from somewhere else. If we go to the Yuan dynasty, we start to see a different picture. Song Lian, Huang Jin, Dai Liang, Su Boheng, Wang Wei, Liu Guan, all local men. And when we go down and look for just 7 connections to 7 unique people, we get a graph like this. It's a much more intensive graph than for Southern Song. There's much more connectivity in Yuan, which goes together with the fact that people are forming local communities, local networks, local identity, and needing local support and local recommendation. And when we do the same numbers, we see that in the top 20, almost all, with the exception of UG, I think, almost all the central people are local people. So they're building that out. And that fits together with the rise of genealogy, with the rise of local identity, and with the circumstances in which they live. The final part, the penultimate part, Chang Wei, I forgot to bring my watch. So how much more time do I have?
5 minutes.
Oh, I could do that in 5 minutes,
Okay.
sure. Not really, but I can try. So this is what happens in Ming. Well, everyone knows that Wuzhou scholars went into the brain trust of Juanzhang, who, when he took Wujo, was a warlord who it's not clear they particularly wanted to work with him, but eventually they do. But even before the reign of Juanzhang, the Hongwu reign was over, the Wujo guys had all lost their place. Song Lian, his descendants are caught up in the purges. He's exiled and either killed or commits suicide. Wang Wei is sent off to the far south and dies. Everyone who had been brought in is, if they haven't hit out and removed themselves, like Dai Liang, who just disappears and goes off to hide in the mountains, or Su Boheng, who moves out and lives in Wenzhou, they all get kicked out of local government. They all lose their place. And so the great hope that they might have had disappears. Now, after the usurpation, it's true that the Yongle Emperor was very generous in giving degrees to Southerners, right? But there was almost no intellectual culture or intellectual activity that we can see from the historical record in Wuzhou. Almost nothing gets written, no books are extant, and we compare that for the first 100 years. Compare that the second 100 years, it's a totally different story. And the story of the revival really has to do with Zhang Mao. There's little that I know that there's a CCTV program that was done about him. But Zhang Mao is the new Lu Zuchen, but different. In the first instance, he comes from a different style. Lu Zuchen came from one of the most illustrious families of the Song. Zhang Mao, not so much. In fact, many people in his family were totally uninterested in education. Lu Zuchen thought he was bringing the learning of his family's traditions to Wuzhou and teaching the locals. Zhang Mao sees himself as defending Jushi's learning. He has great respect for Wu Yubi. He knows Chen Shenzhang. People try to push him because he defends Jushi to be critical of Chen Shenzhang. He's not willing to. Just a little bit maybe, but he respects Chen Shenzhang. He's morally engaged. He respects Wu Yubi for moral engagement. He doesn't write him very much himself, but he keeps up a national network. His correspondence network is a truly national network, Northeast, South, and West. And he is brought in, although he retires, spends 30 years in retirement, he's eventually brought in to be chancellor of the National University in Nanjing towards the end of his life. But what Zhang Mao does is something Lu Zuchen didn't do. Zhang Mao goes back to Wu Shidao and the notion and the Yuan notion of a Wuzhou tradition that begins in Song and resurrects that. And he brings local literati together around a notion of our identity and our tradition. And then when he goes out, he says to everybody in other places, and you guys in other places, you need to have your traditions and your local identity as well. And he is tremendously successful in reasserting the Wuzhou tradition. But eventually, in his own lifetime, Wang Yangmingism starts to get in. And this is going to be my almost last slide. And Daoxue divides into two camps. And as Li Zhenhuan has written about, it begins really in Yongkang. And one of the people there is this man on the left, Cheng Zi, becomes a disciple. And we've been, and some of you may remember, going to the ancestral temple, where they brought out all the portraits of their family from the early Ming. And Daoxue does divide into two camps, and it never recovers from that, I think. So it's a revival, great, successful revival leads to a great split. And the last chapter looks at sort of the end of things, a bit of a conclusion, but also to look at somebody like Hu Yinglin, who comes out of Wuzhou, who identifies with the Wuzhou tradition, right? Positions himself as a continuing a Wuzhou tradition, but redefines it away from a Daoxue history, and who rejects the Wenxue Daoxue accommodation, but still is carried on a tradition of Boxue as he tries to figure out how learning and one could be connected in a new way to lead to new knowledge, rather than simply a process of self-discovery or having an opinion of your own. And that's where the book ends with, in a sense, the end of an era that begins in Southern Song, and arguably, really in Wujo in Southern Song, and the beginning of a new era that begins in the late 16th century, where Hu Yinglin is a follower of Wang Zhen, but a loyal Wuzhou man, a Jinhua man, starts to strike out on a new path towards a new kind of learning. And I think that's all I'm going to say. So I'm going to stop my sharing, and thank you all very much.